Thank you so much to once again, we end every panel with thanks to Jelena and Andja and the whole Center for Euro-Atlantic Studies, and I start this panel with that as well. I'm very honored to be participating in this 8th NATO week in Belgrade. And you've run such a high level and professional conference under such difficult circumstances. So thank you also to the interpreters and to all your support staff who allowed us to run this conference on 2 channels, both on Zoom and YouTube, with interpretation. That was no small feat, especially with all of our COVID restrictions. So now my panelists have the tough task of wrapping up 2.5 days of very substantive and interesting discussion underpinned by the survey that CEAS did on attitudes towards Serbia's potential integration with the European Union, with NATO, toward increased security and political cooperation with the US, and to some extent with Russia. The most important questions, of course, for Serbia's future. Now, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to let our esteemed panelists give their summaries and recommendations for the future. And my introductions will be brief because, of course, you can find all of their bios on the CEAS event website. So now, I'm hoping they're all out there in Zoom land with me here. With my thanks, I'd like to introduce His Excellency Gilles Beschoor. He is the Dutch ambassador to Serbia and also NATO's contact point in Serbia. Ambassador Anthony Godfrey, he is the US ambassador to Serbia. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, he is the retired US Army commander in Europe, which is where I met him, and he is now the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. Also, Benjamin Haddad, he is the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council in the US. Bertram Braun, he is a retired State Department official who served both in Belgrade and at the NSC in Washington. And finally, we'll let the aforementioned Jelena Milić give her own recommendations and takeaways from the conference. So we're going to start with Ambassador Plug. Ambassador, you know, for NATO, there were some pretty disappointing results in the This Is Us survey when it comes to attitudes toward the alliance. Even the level of knowledge about NATO was very low, remarkably low, so low that people were saying, well, that's a huge opportunity to fill that lack of information with positive information and facts about NATO. But if Serbia were to change its opinion about NATO, should that come at NATO's behest? Is this something the alliance should really make a priority? And if so, how would it do that? Thank you very much, Ambassador Plug.
Thank you, Terry, if I may call you that.
Please do.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be at this panel. And let me just clarify for those who are not in the exact know of CPEs and abbreviations like that. Indeed, I'm the Dutch ambassador, but I'm also the ambassador of the Contact Point Embassy, as you mentioned, Terry. And this
but I didn't really know what it meant, so please explain.
NATO, in all its partner countries, NATO has a kind of liaison office, a political liaison office, which is fulfilled by one of the member states for the period of 1 or 2 years. And this year it's the Netherlands. We will give it to Bulgaria as from the 1st of January, but now it's us. And it's a kind of political liaison office. Of course, there is a military liaison office as well, headed by an Italian general in Belgrade, working on specific military issues and defense issues. And we are there for political liaison, for public diplomacy for a great part. And here I come to your point as well. And we are doing that by trying to clarify what NATO exactly is, because I find that in Belgrade, in fact, there's 2 opposing trends I notice as a CP, and these are reflected as well in the conference, Terry. The one trend is that Belgrade and Serbia is one of the most ardent cooperation partners of NATO. I mean, the level of cooperation, both politically, but also in defense matters militarily, is enormous. It's one of the highest partnerships, highest valued partnerships NATO has. But on the other hand side, as you quite rightly mentioned, the image of NATO is disastrous in this country, and the majority of the population think that NATO is not worthwhile joining, let alone other things. And of course, we can clearly see the reason for this. We all know our history. But then, of course, this region is wrought. It's riddled by wars and by conflicts. And I think that finally, in the last few years, we have started getting out of this conflict area and starting to cooperate, not only on a regional level, but also, for example, with the EU. The EU, of course, being the European Union, being the perfect example of how economical cooperation can get countries over political and military confrontations. And that's why we're very happy, and now I'm putting on my EU cap. That's why we are very happy as an EU to see the whole region moving towards EU membership. And I'm sure that in the end, in the long term, hopefully less long than we expect, this will also give rise to a better cooperation in military matters and a better appreciation of defense cooperation mechanisms like NATO in this country. Of course, there is the question as well, which I heard clearly during the conference, whether EU membership doesn't force Serbia into certain defense alliances. Well, I can assure you it certainly will not, because there are plenty of EU members, there are 6 of them, I think, that are not members of NATO. I'm sorry, I'm hesitating because I hear myself. But the discussion on Belarus, which has been waged during the past few weeks, doesn't focus on defense, I think. It focuses on human rights. Although, of course, in the end, these concepts are very much an essential element of security as well. For NATO, the neutrality of Serbia is a given fact, which we appreciate. But neutrality is not necessarily isolation. On the contrary, in the case of Serbia, it entails a balanced international security agenda that includes cooperation with a number of actors.
Hold on one second, Ambassador. We are getting an echo. Maybe can you turn off your audio just for now? But you won't hear me, so I'll make signals at you. Let's see if that works a little better.
Yeah, let's do it like this. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, but you're not allowed to go on talking for a full hour.
To finish, because I think that discussion will be very worthwhile with all of us. But so it doesn't only, it is not isolation neutrality. It entails a balanced security agenda, and it entails cooperation in peace and security missions as well. And I commend Serbia and its government for doing so. But the most important remark I'd like to make, and then I'll stop, is that the way we have this conference tonight, at this point, a virtual conference, points to the fact that there are other threats as well, not only militarily. It can be economically, it can be health. And of course, we need to protect ourselves against these threats as well. NATO is helping there as well. I mean, the Netherlands, and here I put my NATO cap on, has provided logistical help to Montenegro, for example, in the region, in getting medical equipment out of China, which they purchased there. And there is this small committee within NATO, which is called the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Center, which aims at fulfilling a logistical role when it comes to distributing medical equipment, etc. And it is my sincere wish that Serbia could also participate in this kind of cooperation. It doesn't only help itself with medical equipment, but it also raises its image in the defense world. I'll stop here, Terry. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
But let me just go back to my one pointed question. With what we've all recognized is what you say is a disastrous situation for NATO, is it NATO's responsibility or in its interest to go about filling that empty space, the lack of knowledge, or reversing the negative image that the country has? Whether you say it's based on history, whatever the hurdles are you have to get over, is this something that NATO should simply see as something it has to do?
I would say definitely yes, yes. both in the interest of NATO, but also in the interest of the region and Serbia itself.
Okay, that's a very clear recommendation. Good. I'm going to now pass it to Ambassador Godfrey. So, Ambassador, you've been in your post exactly 1 year, you've said, a year that couldn't have been imagined by anyone. But you can be proud, if you can take any credit for this, that attitudes toward the US are extremely positive, unlike towards NATO, or at least they're positive toward the Trump administration. So given that it seemed in this survey that respondents tied this positive view very closely to the current president, the outgoing president, do you expect that this level of positivity, if this good attitude will change with the incoming administration? So thank you very much for taking that off the top.
Well, thanks, Terry, and thank you for that nice introduction, and congratulations again to Jelena and the team at CEAS on the 8th consecutive year, highlighting the value of Serbia's partnership with NATO. This year, more than ever, that value is really abundantly clear. So it's an interesting question that you've asked, and I will jump into it right at the top, and then I'll get into slightly broader remarks, if you don't mind. We have worked hard at the embassy to work to change the perception in Serbia of what America's goals are for the Western Balkans. And I think we've done a very good job of that. We've worked hard at it. And I think, I of course agree with my Dutch colleague that it is our job to work to try and change this perception. And I think we can do a better job to change the perception of NATO in the Western Balkans as well. I would like to make sure that people understand that one of the goals that we had all along was to change the perception of people in Serbia that the United States goal was to hold Serbia back, to keep Serbia down. That's in fact not the case. We worked to help Serbians understand that the United States wants Serbia to achieve its stated strategic goal. And that's, I think, something that we've been successful at. And I'm very proud, frankly, that the survey has said that. And since our goal to help Serbia make progress is going to be consistent, no matter what the outcome of the American election is, I hope and I expect, frankly, that we will be able to continue a lot of this momentum. But, you know, our panel this evening has had a big advantage in taking stock of the last 2 days' discussions. But you're right.
A Bruxelles non capite che non si può tenere un ufficio a minchia come il mio, ma bisogna fare un NATO office.
That's...
Sorry, I was hearing somebody speaking from the NATO office in Italian, which I don't understand very well.
I heard it as well.
Okay.
Just a minute, could I just, while we had this brief interruption, did you say whatever the results of the election are, does that mean that you're not sure?
I work for the Trump administration until the Trump administration is no more. So let's be very clear. I represent the government that appointed me to the government, which is in Serbia. So that's something that you have to explain from time to time, usually not to distinguished panelists like yourself, that you don't get to choose which government you represent or which government you're accredited to. So that's where we are.
I just meant that until the Trump administration concedes, then you presume that you are continuing in office there.
I expect that I will continue in office past January 20th. That is the tradition in American diplomacy, that career diplomats remain across administrations. And that's what I am, a career diplomat for many decades.
Got it. I understand. You're that wasn't what you were trying, the point that you were trying to make.
Not
you mean
strong.
No matter which administration comes into office, the principles
That's
remain.
correct.
Got it. Okay.
Thanks. Just making sure that you understand that. Great. So, when we met almost exactly a year ago, I spelled out my goals for the U.S.-Serbia bilateral relationship. And I'd say that with strong leadership from the highest levels of the U.S. government, President Vučić, Prime Minister Brnabić, together, we really have made substantial progress towards key areas of cooperation between our countries. And that's exactly what I talked about in my confirmation testimony before the US Senate and before this audience. So on September 4th at the White House, we did turn a page to the next chapter of the relationship. We've gone well beyond the high expectations I had speaking before this panel last November. And we've done it not just despite the pandemic, but maybe even because of the pandemic. Our friendship is rooted in 140 years of diplomatic relations and has withstood many tests. Our shared strategic goals transcend party politics, and the election results in either of our countries and will persist beyond next January. So as a result of the Washington agreements, Serbia and Kosovo, both NATO partners, are on the path to economic normalization. The Development Finance Corporation formally opened its doors in our embassy last month and will soon begin to underwrite and I think unlimited future of economic cooperation between the United States and Serbia. I've had a number of initial meetings with Serbia's new government ministers, all of whom are personally engaged in deepening our partnership and Serbia's integration into European institutions to consolidate a democratic, prosperous, and secure future for the Serbian people. And as we emerge from an incredibly challenging 2020, the future, I'd say, is bright. So last year, I emphasized that the United States is only one of 30 countries that comprise the alliance. Our conversation before 2020 on the benefits of the alliance, partnership, and cooperation were in many ways hypothetical. But in 2018, Serbia hosted NATO's largest ever disaster response exercise. And when I spoke before you in 2019, none of us could have imagined that NATO's Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Center would, in just a few months' time, play such a critical role in coordinating and delivering critical relief to the whole region. So as we take stock of conversations in these past 2 days, I think it's worthwhile to step back and consider NATO's practical value in the 2020 context as a collective security organization and as a political body, both to its allies and partners, Serbia included. So we always talk about the goal of closer Euro-Atlantic integration and assume that it has self-evident value. But why? And what practical benefit does this have for Serbia? How about for the United States and its allies? The NATO Week panels this year have done a great job spelling out these benefits and considering where we go from here. Now that they've been so clearly demonstrated under extremely challenging circumstances. To us, the idea of this year's conference to continue or not to continue has a simple answer. Euro-Atlantic integration is America's strategic goal for Serbia and Serbia's goal for itself. So this vision, this shared vision, is driven by our shared sacrifices, history, and our common commitment to democratic values, rule of law, fair trade, and security cooperation, which is, of course, NATO's founding remit. This vision respects Serbia's military neutrality, but it unambiguously counts Serbia among the Euro-Atlantic community of nations. We all know that Serbia's future is in a unified and free Europe. So in this context, the CEAS rightly included a panel on strengthening U.S.-Serbia defense cooperation. And I'd like to echo the conclusions of that conversation and my friend Laura Cooper's welcoming remarks. We're ready to expand cooperation to achieve our shared security goals, to increase defense industry engagement, and mill-to-mill training and educational exchanges to bolster Serbia's leading role as an exporter of stability. We undertake defense cooperation within the NATO alliance because allies face common threats. As 2020 has so clearly demonstrated, those common threats extend to partners like Serbia too, and they extend well beyond the 20th century definition of a traditional military threat. So partners and allies support each other not just because it's the right thing to do, but because we're stronger together. It's often said that if we didn't have NATO, we'd have to invent it, a truism made all too evident by the pandemic. In concert with our allies who contributed medical supplies and PPE when they were needed most via the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Relief Coordination Center, the United States has contributed over $3 million to support Serbia's response to COVID-19. This work continues. Just this week, I had planned to visit Niš to mark the donation of $340,000 worth of high-tech equipment to the medical university. Last December, none of us could have imagined that the PCR test machine donated to Niš's clinical center would soon become so critical. This summer, we marked the donation of European Command-funded technological upgrades to the clinical center in Belgrade. And we also anticipate the groundbreaking of other EUCOM-funded projects like the renovations to the Mara Center and the Gornja Toponica Special Hospital in Niš, as well as the Pulmonology Department of the Mother and Child Institute here in Belgrade. So as we conclude this evening, let's recall that interoperability, coordination, communication, and mutual understanding all have intrinsic value. That's abundantly clear to the NATO Week audience, but the real dividends are paid when we face a crisis together. For many in Serbia, NATO remains a four-letter word, but we're all working hard to change these perspectives. And I'm optimistic that the alliance's active role to assist the region is having some commensurate positive impact to rightly improve its standing with the Serbian people. I'm also certain that in another year's time, we'll be once again considering the real practical benefits of Serbia's partnership with NATO and its 30 allies in 2021. Jelena, thank you again and your CEAS team for this fantastic organization, and most importantly, for the hard work of promoting the truth of our cooperation to the Serbian people. Thanks.
Best one-liner so far goes to you.
Uh-oh.
And so, Ambassador, let me just ask you a quick sort of yes or no question to follow up on what I asked Ambassador Plug. Then, does the United States have a responsibility to help improve the image of NATO? I mean, how much I don't know how much you're doing, but with the numbers so low, there's certainly a lot of work to be done. Given that Serbia doesn't want to join at the moment, what should that space be used for in improving the image of NATO?
Right. So it's a great question. And the United States is often misperceived as synonymous with NATO by a lot of Serbians. And I think that the results of this survey show that that is changing. And that's a good thing. But yes, as one of 30 allies, the United States does bear a responsibility to try and, as I said at the beginning, change the perception of the Serbian people, of the goals of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I think we can make a lot of success in this. And it's a challenge in Serbia and in a lot of places, frankly, in the Western Balkans to get folks to look forward and not back. And that's one of the things that we'd like to do more of.
Thank you very much. And that also leads me well into our next speaker, and that is General Hodges. And Ben, you know, and you speak often about the fact that when there aren't facts in a space, that can easily get filled with disinformation. And certainly with something like 40% of people in this survey saying they don't know much about NATO at all, that allows malign actors to basically make it a playground, doesn't it? I know that that's one of the recommendations that you're going to bring up tonight. So thanks very much. General Hodges, take it away.
Terry, thanks. And I am going to add my accolades to Jelena and the CEAS team for pulling this together. Everybody that's participated tonight probably already did 2 or 3 other Zoom events. You're doing this all the time, back to back, and yet everybody showed up tonight to report to Jelena. And so that's the power of what CEAS does, and I'm proud of her and her team. Also, I'm extremely proud of our U.S. ambassador and the embassy team there in Belgrade. This is competitive space. I mean, there's no easy days there for the embassy in Belgrade. And so what Ambassador Godfrey and his team have done there, I'm proud of it. Look, this is about great power competition. I didn't make up that phrase. I know it's in vogue now, but when we talk about competition, I actually believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict. Because when you compete in the diplomatic space, in the information space, and the economic space, as well as military security cooperation, we are conveying to any potential adversary that this place matters to us, that we are going to invest in it. And it reduces the chance of a terrible miscalculation by the other side that, well, we could probably go in here and do something and the U.S. won't do anything or NATO won't do anything. And so that's why the competition is so important, especially when we're talking about diplomacy and information and holding people accountable to international law, to live up to what they said they were going to do, and to compete in the economic space. I mean, who could blame Serbia or other countries for looking for Chinese investment? Because we all want better roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, seaport. And if the West does not compete in the economic space, the Chinese are going to fill it up and leave people with these debt traps. So in the diplomatic space, of course, to things that have been addressed over the last couple of days, we have got to give people like President Vučić some space to do the hard negotiating, to do what needs to be done. He has no easy days. He's got people all around him chewing on his leg about you cannot give up anything. You're a traitor if you agree to anything with Kosovo. So with Pristina. So give leaders space, protect them from some of these outside influences. That's just part of the diplomatic competition. And of course, that means working with the European Union as a part of that. The United States, no matter what, we cannot by ourselves bring about a lasting resolution because it's so much more complicated. In the information space, this is where we have not been as effective despite best efforts. And there's a specific example, and this is about depleted uranium. There is a false narrative flying around out there that somehow NATO's use of munitions that included depleted uranium back in 1999 are responsible for this a cancer epidemic of some sort. And then somehow Serbia has the highest breast cancer rate of any country in Europe. And they've tried to connect it to NATO's use of munitions in 1999 that included depleted uranium. This is obvious to anybody that's serious about science and is serious about medicine knows this is a completely false narrative. If this was true, then everybody in the Air Force would be dying of cancer today. Okay, I mean, it's not a fact. NATO and the United Nations both have had separate independent committees do scientific studies, and they've all come to the conclusion, beginning back in 2001, that this is simply not true. So why does this false narrative continue to have traction in Serbia? Why do almost 80% of Serbians believe somehow that depleted uranium contributes to cancer inside Serbia? Well, obviously, this is all about undermining any sort of legitimacy of NATO as a partner for Serbia. We're not talking about Serbian membership in NATO. We're talking about the NATO and the countries of NATO, led by the United States, as a partner for the future of Serbia. Who would be interested in that? The Kremlin, the Chinese Communist Party, which pays for documentaries that keep this bogus narrative alive. And then, of course, people who have no incentive to see Serbia be able to move forward. It is people who believe that who live in the past. For sure, we could all learn from the past. As General Jelena, when he was the SACEUR and I was a very young officer, and this was at the time of the Dayton Peace Accords, and he told all the leaders of the former Yugoslav Republic, he said, look, you can learn from the past, but you cannot live in the past. And it was so important to get beyond that, to think about people, young people's future. So only people who do not care about Serbia's future, who choose to live in the past, who have no incentive to see this resolved, that's who keeps this narrative alive. Now, I think NATO has got to do a much better job of explaining this, that we come out of every couple of years. NATO reminds everybody about these independent studies that were done and that refutes all this, but yet you still have 80%. So clearly the alliance has got to take on a much more aggressive approach in this, the way we do when we challenge other false narratives around Europe. When we don't do it here, then it almost looks like, okay, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe we're maybe we're not serious about this. So I think the alliance has got to do a better job here. In the military space, we actually have more exercises between Serbian military and NATO or US and other allies than they do with anybody else. So I was always satisfied with what we were able to do with the US Army when they would come down and we would train with Serbian land forces. Actually, I think when you think about the experience that Balkan nations led by Serbia have with earthquakes, what a great opportunity for NATO's military forces to focus, to work closely with our Serbian partners on disaster relief, on consequence management after earthquakes, for example. This is, who would be against that? So this is an area where we want to work. And then finally, the final sort of domain of the great power competition is economy. Western integration. Young people, when I had the chance to meet President Vučić, and I wouldn't have the access that Ambassador Godfrey does, but I met him one time, and the first thing he brought up was how many young people leave Serbia because they see no future there. They go west. And so for Serbia to have a future, young people have to believe that there's healthcare, that there's a job, there's a reason to stay other than to be close to their parents. And so I think this is where private investment is so important, sustained private investment, and what can we do? And of course, Western integration, which the Kremlin absolutely does not want. This is where the EU has such a critical role. And I think the United States working closely with our European allies and partners is going to be essential. I apologize, Madam Moderator, for going too long.
It's all right. We've all gone a little bit long. I'm going to even ask you a quick follow-up after that. What do you think is keeping the investment out? I moderated a panel earlier this afternoon, and we talked a lot more about Russia. So do you think the insecurity over Serbia's perhaps overly balanced position toward Moscow is keeping cash out, or what's the problem?
Well, I think number one, if I was an investor, let's say if I worked for a business, I would want to know, I would want to have transparency in all the legal processes and the financial processes. If I invest, for simple infantry math, if I invest $10 million into a project, am I going to see where all that $10 million goes? Am I going to get what I think I'm investing in? And is there a legal process that if something goes wrong, will I be able to get my money out? So this comes down to, what we expect in a liberal democracy of transparency of governance, transparency of judicial systems, transparency of financial institutions. I think until we have that, then I think serious money people will be reluctant to invest. And then, of course, I think even the most cold-hearted financier is going to want to know that they're contributing to something that has a purpose. And so here's where I think our embassy and the EU can also talk about why an investment, not only is it good business, but it also contributes to stability and security in the region, which benefits Europe. And of course, because Europe is our biggest trading partner, it benefits the United States. My last visit to Belgrade, I remember when I crossed over the river from the old part of town to the new part of town, the first thing as I saw once I crossed the bridge were two gigantic signs, billboards. And that's when I realized what I'm going against. One was for Gazprom, the other was for Huawei. I mean, these were massive Texas-sized billboards. They dominated the skyline. That's who we're competing with.
Or not competing.
Or not, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Next up, Benjamin Haddad from the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. How important is Serbia in any vision of Europe's future on one side? And from Belgrade's perspective, can it both integrate with Europe in this way and maintain its close relationship with Russia and, as Ben noted, with China? I mean, are those two things going to be compatible enough that Serbia can be successful in moving ahead?
Thanks, Terry. And first, I just want to say I'm really delighted to be here. You know how much the Western Balkans and Serbia matter to the Atlantic Council, the Future Europe Initiative. We're really committed to the transatlantic partnership to get the region closer to the Euro-Atlantic community. And I think in this respect, you know, the next few years really open an important window of opportunity for transatlantic cooperation, for US-EU NATO partnership to be more involved in the region. I think it's important to give credit in this respect to the Trump administration in the last few years for having actually been quite committed, especially to Kosovo-Serbia dialogue and to U.S. engagement. But I think what's been missing a little bit from the picture is the strong bond with Europeans. And I think there's no strong U.S. engagement in the region, especially as, to your point, we think of this in the context of great power competition, of containing Russian and Chinese influence, which also includes, fighting dirty money, kleptocracy, screening investments. There's no way forward without having a strong bond with the European Union. I think it'll be important, as Europeans are starting progressively, and I think that's a good step, are starting to think of themselves more as a geopolitical power. That's a priority of the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, of a Europe that is able to harness its instruments of economic aid or regulatory power, norms and standards on energy or technology more through geopolitical lens and through a power lens. I think it's a positive step that they start thinking of their own neighborhood in this respect. But I think the European engagement, unfortunately, despite I think this rhetorical shift in the right direction, has been so far too shy, a little underwhelming. I think the news that's coming out today on North Macedonia and the EU is pretty worrying in this respect. So we'll need to keep a strong U.S. engagement, but it will have to be with Europeans. And to your point, yes, I think Serbia, like other countries, will have to make choices if it wants to be domestic choices, but also geopolitical choices if it wants to be anchored to the Euro-Atlantic community. But that the only way forward to this is a stronger transatlantic engagement, strategic and economic engagement in the region. The reason why Russia and China are stepping up is precisely because we leave a vacuum. We see this all over the European neighborhood. Very often, Europeans have themselves to blame for this. So the fact that they're thinking geopolitically more is good. I think a Biden administration should harness this, should shape it as an opportunity, not for transatlantic decoupling, but having stronger European partners within NATO and the transatlantic community, and that will have to start in the Western Balkans.
Well, the European Union, it's not that they haven't tried. It's not that they're completely absent. You had very strong initiatives by both Federica Mogherini and even Catherine Ashton before her to get, remember how they used to have separate dinners because they wouldn't be in the same, the Serbian and Kosovo sides wouldn't be in the same room together. So, they have tried. Borrell, I think, has been less visible on that scene at the moment, but it just seems that only the U.S. has managed to make inroads. Is that's simply a geopolitical reality in that area, don't you think?
No, I think you're completely right. There was a momentum about 10 years ago, and we saw especially Cathy Ashton between Kosovo and Serbia. Look, there's a risk with all the crises that Europeans have been going through in the last 10 years, and COVID is one more, of inward-lookingness, right? And last summer, Europeans adopted a pretty ambitious recovery package together. But I'm a little concerned that this comes at the expense of also thinking about the rest of the world and their neighborhood. A lot of the countries, not only in the Western Balkans, will be under a lot of financial pressure coming out of the global crisis leading to COVID. It's really important, and once again, this is something on which the US and the EU should work together. It's really important not to let countries like China step up and compensate the financial needs of these countries. If you don't want to see a Belt and Road on steroids, with more countries being indebted to China in the next few years, I think you need to think of especially the neighborhood of the EU when we talk about recovery package. Otherwise, all this conversation that I welcome, by the way, on a geopolitical Europe or more responsible Europe on the world stage will be mostly ineffective.
Which would be counterproductive, given that both NATO and the EU are now telling their governments that they must keep out this Chinese investment in key strategic assets. So it would do them well to look further afield, to look at Serbia as well. I think that would go along with what you're saying.
Yeah.
But what you said about... Sorry.
No, and just one very quick point, you know, on technology. That's a good example, because there is a conversation right now on Chinese telecommunication technology, and especially with the influence of Huawei. And you know, what's interesting in this respect, that's a little missing from the European conversation, is that the 5G technology is also European. You have major European companies like Nokia and Ericsson that actually have 5G technology. It's not, you know, Americans trying to impose their own corporate interest on Europeans. And so I think this is clearly an example where a stronger sense of European self-interest actually would be also very valuable to the transatlantic relationship and to a more democratically liberal agenda in the region.
Well, that moves us well into our next speaker, Bertram Braun, advocating for a stronger transatlantic partnership on issues like Serbia. Bert Braun, you have worked both in the State Department inside Belgrade and then in the NSC in Washington. Do you think with the incoming Biden administration, the idea of transatlantic partnership is going to be easier? The Trump administration gets plenty of kudos in Serbia, but in the rest of Europe, people are very much looking to turn over a new leaf, aren't they?
Absolutely. I totally agree. A Biden administration will be much better for transatlantic cooperation. Biden is a deeply committed Euro-Atlanticist. He, going back 30 years, he has traveled to Europe hundreds of times. He's come to Serbia many times. He knows the European leaders, and that is one of the big advantages of having a new administration that can work closely with the EU on a variety of issues, but especially, in my opinion, obviously my area of interest, the Balkans. And one thing I said in the panel earlier is that what I'd like to see is the US and the EU form a joint strategy with coordinated implementation to move forward together. Because my experience in the Balkans is whenever the United States and the EU are unified and put real effort behind it, we can do almost anything. The question is, let's focus on the key things: EU integration and regional integration as part of EU integration, and solving all the remaining impediments to those steps. So yes, I think a Biden administration will be excellent for Euro-Atlantic cooperation, and I think that can be excellent for Serbia. So let me thank you again for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be in Belgrade, at least by video and in spirit.
I saw you earlier. This is your second Zoom call in your life, isn't it?
Second Zoom call in my life, yes.
Both of them today.
I had strong technical support from my kids. So I'd like to make 8 quick points, including a lot of that stuff that I already said. First of all, US-Serbian relations have made significant progress. As was already stated, I think a lot of credit goes to Ambassador Godfrey and his staff at the embassy, many of them friends of mine, and one of the best embassies in the world. But the credit also goes to the Serbian government for really doing positive outreach, for having a policy of great pragmatism and reasonableness for the region, for keeping its narrative calm and positive, for reaching out to Washington. The reason that there's good administration and Trump administration and Serbian progress was largely, in my opinion, due to Serbia reaching out and finding those connections, finding those areas where the administration and Serbia had joint interests. And obviously economic normalization, that's an area of joint interest. And the polling shows that with a little bit of effort on both sides, the public sees it, recognizes it, and welcomes it. And the fact that the US standing has gone up significantly is, for me, a wonderful development. Secondly, similarly with NATO and Serbia, it continues to improve and intensify. And even though the public remains, let's say, unhappy with NATO, and it's obvious why, we've all seen the defense ministry downtown, things like that, the cooperation between Serbia and NATO, especially at the professional level, has been outstanding. And so I think I very much welcome the fact that the Serbian speakers, the Serbian government speakers, all said that they welcome that cooperation. They intend to continue it and intensify it. And I think eventually the Serbian people will come around, but these are tough memories. To be honest, my mother lived through the bombing in World War II, and she continues to talk about it every time we talk. It's a traumatic experience to be bombed from the air. So let's be understanding on that. Also, the third point I'd like to make is both both US and NATO clearly recognize Serbia's military neutrality and welcome it, really, in a way. And several of the speakers, especially some of the NATO speakers, pointed out that military neutrality is not incompatible with close cooperation, Euro-Atlantic integration in the broader sense, and certainly not incompatible with EU integration and regional integration. So I think that recognition and that positive recognition of Serbia's military neutrality is a very positive development. Not everyone has to be a member of NATO. There's many wonderful, wonderful countries in Europe that aren't, and that's fine. Along those lines, I'd like to make a bit of a personal point now also. This is purely personal observation. There's a lot of talk about great power competition, and it has kind of been adopted as a strategic concept by the US, and NATO to a degree. I, with all due respect, of course, to the general and others, I don't like the idea of great power competition, because that term really comes from the pre-World War I period. And first of all, the situation today in the world is completely, totally, fundamentally different than the situation pre-World War I. The fact that there's a couple of great powers, okay, but everything else, technology, economy, everything else is totally different. But secondly, more importantly, the great power competition dynamic prior to World War I led to World War I and indirectly led to World War II. And that's not the direction we want to go. So in my view, our strategic concept should be great power cooperation. We should minimize and to some degree ignore our differences and maximize and work hard on mutual interests. And there are so many things that have to be done: climate change and the broader environmental issues that face the world, global public health, preventing future pandemics, collective security broadly defined, anti-organized crime, preventing wars, stopping wars, and of course, global prosperity, lifting living standards, but in a sustainable way that is also good for all human beings, not just a small elite. So I think, for me anyways, I would love to see a strategic concept as a basis for policy that is great power cooperation and not competition. And in that direction, I actually support and welcome Serbia's policy of having good relations with all of the major powers, US, EU, Russia, and China. If I were in leadership position in Serbia, I'd do the same thing. Serbia should do what's best for it, and it can get the best thing from each of those relationships. There's things that China can help Serbia with that we cannot. There's some we can help Serbia with that China cannot. Same thing. And I think we make too much of the differences and the dangers and not enough of the synergistic effect. If we invest in Serbia and China invest in Serbia, that's better than if just we invest in Serbia. If we invest in Serbia and EU countries invest in Serbia and Russia, that's even better. So why not welcome all that? So that's just a digression. I apologize.
It's okay. We only have a few minutes left.
Okay, I'll keep it quick.
Can you just wrap up your last points?
Yes. Fourth, all the panelists agreed that normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina is crucial. And here again, many in Belgrade and many in Pristina look at it as a zero-sum game. When in fact, it can be a win-win game. A solution to the Kosovo issue can unlock enormous benefits for Serbia, Kosovo, and the region. And the EU and the US should work together to help make it a win-win situation and encourage the two parties to see it as a win-win dynamic, whether that's more incentives, bigger, better carrots, whatever, but make it work. Third, regional integration, mini Schengen, Washington agreements, Sofia summit, all going the same direction, very important, and especially important as part of the EU integration process. I very much welcome the regional agreement on regional common market. Sixth, EU integration is the core strategy. As I already said, US can help on that and should help on that. That's a key role for the US to help the EU with EU integration. It's in our interest and in the EU's interest. Next, we've already talked about the Biden administration.
Okay.
And finally, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's very urgent. But I encourage people to look at it as a positive thing with joy, with the opportunities, not to make fear or worries. I am so optimistic about the Balkans and the potential for Balkan integration into Europe, and we should work on this hard, but with the sense that we are accomplishing something historic and really valuable, and enjoy that and celebrate it, and not always talk about the fears and the negatives.
To be honest,
what
I've heard on the conference has been very optimistic. And
exactly. And that's why I welcome this conference. Which leads to the last point. I want to thank Jelena, especially the fearless Jelena.
We need to leave time for Jelena to come and talk herself. She's also on the panel, but I wanted to.
I'll leave it. Fantastic job to Jelena and her staff.
And talk about any of the points there. Did anybody else want to?
Sure. Terry, would you mind if I jumped in just for a second?
I wouldn't mind.
It's Anthony Godfrey. I just wanted to make a couple of maybe corrections to the record.
I thought you might.
Yeah. First, Benjamin, it's not really my place to do it. Maybe it's Gilles, but the EU has been incredibly generous with its COVID assistance, and on a scale that the United States just can't compete with. And not in loans, but in actual grants. It's been appropriately acknowledged, by the way, by the government of Serbia. I wish it got a little bit more ink, and I wish more people knew about it, but that's the environment that we live in. And then second, Bert, while I acknowledge that you have the right to your political view, and I welcome your optimism, I think we need to give the Trump administration a lot of credit for the positive momentum in the U.S.-Serbia bilateral relationship. It gave the Kosovo-Serbia relationship a lot of focus, a lot of attention, a lot of energy, and hey, some resources too. So there's a lot of things that we should give the administration credit for. And even Rick Grenell's harshest critics agree that his approach to increasing the pace of engagement has changed the way that the EU has engaged in the Western Balkans. So I think that there's a lot that the Trump administration can be proud of. But just wanted to leave it there, Terry. Thanks.
Ambassador Plug, did you want to hop in?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Terry. I won't go into the EU arguments because it's a NATO conference. Can you hear me?
I can't. Oh, you can hear him? Okay, then it's not you, it's me. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's hope that changes soon. No, it's not about the EU because this is a NATO conference. And I'd just like to remark that, of course, we're all experts here. We know NATO, we know the actual circumstances in this part of the world. But the people we need to convince are the populations that elect our governments. And I think it's important to point out and to keep on pointing out that NATO is not the US, NATO is not Germany, it's not the Netherlands. It doesn't have an army. It's a cooperation between countries and a very sophisticated one. We're all 30 democracies, almost all, I hasten to say, and we've got a parliamentary assembly. So it's not a war machine. It's a tool to cooperate in order to to establish peace and security and stability and health. It's merely an instrument to reach ulterior goals. And I think we should stress that everywhere and all times. Thank you. And I'd like to add to that, because I didn't do that yet. I kept it for the last. My compliments to Jelena for, again, a wonderful conference.
She's coming on, I swear. We're going to save her some minutes here on her own conference. Ben Hodges, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, first of all, the Ambassador Godfrey, of course, is correct. There was nothing meaningful or significant in the history of the world that was ever accomplished by a room full of really nice, quiet, patient people sitting around a table.
I love that.
We have always required people to come in and break glass to make things happen. So I do think, even though I disagree with like 99% of what Ambassador Grinnell did when he was in Berlin, what he helped do in the Balkans is going to save lives, and it helped move things along. As far as Bert, who I compliments for an incredible beard, I'm so envious. The competition, yeah, I reject totally your comparison to pre-World War I and great powers. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that the United States we have to compete in the diplomatic space. We have to show that we care about Russia's constant violations of international law. We have to shine the light on that. And we can only do that effectively, of course, when we're working with our European allies. That's the kind of competition I'm talking about, where in what we learned in Staff College and in War College, the DIME, Diplomacy, Information, Military Economy Framework, everybody I know that's ever been in military wants the M to be lowercase and the D and the I and the E to be capital letters.
Well, you do a lot towards helping us all understand that since you got out of uniform and can talk. Ben, did you want to come back in? Are you still there? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
One more quick one, and then Jelena, we're coming to you.
Having fun, though. I'm enjoying myself. I'm listening to
You
this.
already had a glass of wine. Oh my goodness.
I'm hiding from Ben. Ben is always criticizing me.
No, this is so good. Can we have another hour then, Jelena?
As far as I'm concerned, I locked up my cats in another room, so I'm fine.
Okay, Ben.
Yeah, first, I strongly agree with everything that Ben Hodges said, both on the necessity sometimes to break some glass, but also on the importance of the US-EU coordination on this. Just to echo one, I think, point that's important by Bertram earlier is the efforts at the economic regional integration that we've seen in the last year or so, the Sofia summit, the talk on mini Schengen, although I know that this is not how it's called anymore, but I think this is important, and Belgrade has taken an important role in this respect. It can't go without normalization of relations with Pristina for sure, but I think it's important to show also to Europeans that the region is stepping up and taking responsibility for itself. There's been some criticism sometimes they could be seen as incompatible or going in parallel of the process with Europe, but I don't think that's at all how it should be seen. I think it's actually a positive step in the right direction that should be encouraged by Washington and Brussels as being part also of the region reforming, taking steps towards integration and progressively then integration in the Euro-Atlantic community.
So thanks, Bert, for coming and breaking a little glass in our panel and waking these guys up. I'm going to let Jelena come in because she actually, after all of these kudos and all of the hard work, she gets to give us her own takeaways from the conference. She may be the only person, one of the only people who has seen every minute of it. I've had to dip in and out as probably most others have. But Jelena, what are your takeaways from this really substantive conference? Honestly, it's every time I could listen, I was just really, nobody was sleeping on the job here.
Hvala.
Do you hear translation? I'm very tired and I would prefer to speak Serbian if it's okay with you. Do you have interpretation? Please wave to the lady to show that you can hear her. A small observation. Before the start of our panel, I looked at the internet presentation, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Deutsche Welle, BBC. Not a single reference to our 3 days. Radio Free Europe, just the infographic, tiny one, about this survey and not signed properly. I'm not saying this because I'm complaining or about some things that I mentioned yesterday that were not a classic selection of topics as by way of introduction at the conference. But I wanted to point out dangerous trends in the past 4 years that I do not like at all, and I can see similar ones in the US. From those that I least expected, who were my intellectual environment and engagement environment in the past period, if I may say so. Couple of recommendations. Serbia is a much different country than in the 90s. It went through the most difficult transformation than any other country in the region, with special challenges left by Milošević's regime, and it deserves to be treated as such. In particular, when you look more closely at the situation in other parts of the region, Belgrade deserves better understanding of political West, its arguments in negotiations with Pristina, and recognition of peaceful policy towards the countries in the region. Undesirable developments can always be blamed on Belgrade. That is often done. Institutions of transactional justice, open society, donor policies of Western donors, free media, and proclaimed so-called well-meaning organizations of political West should not be instrumentalized in order to achieve predefined outcome on the new status of Kosovo. We need principles. We need flexibility too. In today's world of global harassment and discreditation of reference systems in the world that is shaken by erosion of credibility of these institutions can be dangerous for the West and for the Balkans. We need cooperation of European Union, NATO, and EU here in the Balkans rather than bickering of great powers. And this is what we have been seeing lately. Yes, it's good when European Union and the US cooperate. But this suggestion that we heard about Trump's administration can be seen from the other side. The fact is that all key questions in the Balkans were resolved only when the U.S. was directly involved, and it still only has concrete influence on Kosovo. I am now suspicious whether European Union was ever honest in its efforts to convince Kosovo to remove fees and tariffs, and without Trump's administration and Granol, what would we have done? Now, I harassed Ben a few years ago and everybody else. Bert, don't leave us to the Russians. Now I'm in the stage. Do not leave us to the Europeans. With due respect, while we are talking now, Bulgaria is now blocking the start of these unhappy negotiations with Northern Macedonia that went through incredible things. New enlargement policy, generally the decision-making method in the European Union are so complex, and there is so much room for shifting blame. The prospect of European integration, I am losing trust in it. I cannot even imagine what Croatia will be doing to us when we start serious negotiation process. Just look at visa liberalization for Kosovo. How many months we have been listening? Avoidance of it's a ticking bomb, and European officials are avoiding blame. It's a ticking bomb for a region. If Kosovo doesn't get visa liberalization as soon as possible, I am supportive, and I wish we discussed more of that today. When we talk about results, about the readiness of cooperation of Serbia, readiness to cooperate with the U.S., and we saw in the past 4 years this has been strengthened. Allow me to say that there is absolutely no reason why Biden's administration would not analyze in great detail and see how small risk they have brought, almost nothing. But I would like to remind you that our first panel, to continue or not to continue, Mr. Braun did point out the absurd Trump's policy in the region was excellent, but for the rest he wasn't so sure. problems in the Balkans in 2020 are not those that existed in 1999. The relations between Pristina and Belgrade are now completely different, and they have to be diagnosed and resolved in line with 2020 realities on the ground, with new reality in the world, and with new accessible mechanisms that we now have and didn't have in the past, based on the same principles, making sure that punishment is fair. Serbia, on the other hand, has to take reforms in the areas that are not directly related to Kosovo negotiations in order to deserve support of Kosovo for legitimate arguments, further democratization and financial support that is getting from the West. Support to to cooperation for the U.S. is there, and the government needs to use that in common interest. We heard today all different benefits that our army can have, our armament industry can have, that would relax the life of Serbs in Kosovo. And I think that is one of the benefits that would be brought by military cooperation. The second thing that Serbia must do, disinformation campaign about NATO bombardment must be interrupted and finally resolved. And also Bitici brother murder has to be resolved to create grounds for trust and operationalization of desired wish for further cooperation with the U.S. and the EU integration process. Serbia must quickly start and follow more intensively debates about strategic autonomy of EU, possibility to create European pillar of NATO, and then what about our military neutrality? Is it in conflict with EU integration process in that case? And one more key conclusion, and that is that the entire CEAS team was phenomenal. And thank you very much. I know that for some of you, this was just another Zoom, but please understand us. For us, this is a full-fledged international conference that we organized in 2 languages, and not just another Zoom. Not just another Zoom for us. We kept this many top-notch speakers in 3 days, classic agenda, and we had people who spoke to us from 8 time zones, or 8 hours difference, and we did manage to align all that and overcome all that. So I don't think we've had any technical issues. So for us, NATO gave us green light to conduct this conference only 10 days ago. I don't know how many of you are aware how specific, how many procedures there are for a small NGO to cooperate with NATO. It took me 5 days to explain that this is an agreement between Belgrade and Pristina, not Serbia and Kosovo. And then we got other support a month ago. Without your understanding and understanding of other speakers who have been supporting CEAS, we would not have been able to put all this together, and I would really, truly like to thank you for that. And also I would like to thank Tanjug Press Agency that broadcast live all our panels, and CEAS will bring together all our YouTubes. I would really like to thank the government authorities of the Republic of Serbia. This is the 4th and 5th time consecutive that our NATO events are organized in Palace of Serbia. This time it was particularly important because of the quantity of technical equipment that it had to enter instead of people, and at the same time for us to be able to comply with the measures preventing meetings between with more than 5 people. This is the most difficult day in Serbia since the start of COVID pandemic. So not more than 5 people meeting. That's my Anja Petković is sitting there, and I'm sitting here because of this ban on having more than 5 people at the same place. And this was introduced only a few days ago, and I don't know if anybody has organized something like this. These are these 5 ladies that you can see on the screen. It's 5 of us. This is CEAS, and I would like to thank them. And at the end, we now This is our latest report. This is us. Please read it when you find the time, because people have been grumbling. We have put this on only a couple of pages. Terry, with all of this from CEAS and from me, good night and good luck. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jelena. I don't think anyone considers this just another Zoom. You had such high-level participants with such substantive contributions. Everyone understands that this is a really important question, not just for Serbia, but for all of Europe. And I hope that you feel that with all the mentions of you that we can't feel what it was like to put this together in just a few days, but we understood that you were doing a magnificent job. So thank you for all of us. I think we heard some really interesting comments here, and although I was more optimistic and before we heard from you, I think there's still so much work to do and so much will to do it. So thank you. I hope that this was of help for you as well there in a small office there. You guys did a magnificent job, really. Thank you so much. Thank you to all my panelists. Thanks for hanging in there late tonight and for contributing to this effort. And I hope the 9th conference that we will be back in Belgrade.
My has to be last. When I said great participants, I assumed you moderators as the participants as well, for Christ's sake. You are experts as well. It was really, the moderation was superb and we made an extra effort. Hey, Jelena brought Terry Schultz to NATO week.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
Pleasure.
Thank you, bro.
It was fun. I said yes immediately. Just had to find the time. Thank you so much. No, really, I'm very honored to have been here and to get to wrap up and to get to give the last thanks of the 3 days to you, Jelena, and to our panelists and to everyone. Hopefully no COVID next year and another Belgrade conference in person. And that will be a wrap. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. See you next year.